Hello, Summit Climbers. Thank you for joining me today for this climb. Mr. McKee here, and today we're going to talk about some genetics. So first thing, I want to point out what we're going to be doing today for this lesson and some resources that you might need. If you look on my calendar, you can see the learning targets. I'll go over those with you here in a moment. And if you find that you're not remembering some vocabulary from earlier in the year, please check out the vocabulary links. It's my Quizlet page, and that's got all the foundational genetic stuff that we've talked about there. And we're going to be completing a practice assignment, mainly focusing on how to use Punnett squares later on. And down here at the bottom, I hand-selected some videos that I think will help you if you're still feeling a little bit confused after watching my video, which you're watching right now. So here we go. Again, thank you for being here. Our learning targets for today. I can describe how traits are passed from parents to offspring, and I can use a Punnett square to predict the probability of a trait being passed to offspring. And I just wanted to mention we're going to be focused on primarily on sexually reproducing organisms here, okay? And kind of a quick definition of what that means. We're talking about offspring that are a mix of both parents as opposed to asexual organisms. We'll touch on that particular kind of inheritance later on in the unit. So let's get going here. I want to kick things off with a little genetics joke for you guys. What was the geneticist's favorite pickup line? I wish I was adenine, then I could get paired up with you. So if you don't get that one, you might want to go back and rewatch the video I posted about DNA structure. You still probably won't think it's funny, which I understand, but it's always good to brush up on some DNA structure. So let's start by talking about body cells. Body cells in humans or in any other animal or plants for that matter, for the most part, there's a few exceptions. You're going to have 2 of each chromosome. That is 2 complete sets of chromosome. So one of those chromosomes comes from mom and one comes from dad. And on each of those chromosomes is, on average, you see quite a bit of variation from one chromosome to another, but on the average you have about 1,000 genes per chromosome. So this fact that you get one of each chromosome from mom and one from dad explains Mendel's observation that an individual has 2 factors for each trait. Okay, and we've talked about Mendel already. I'll revisit some of Mendel's findings later on, but there is a video on my calendar also to review some of those basics from Mendel. So there's an analogy for chromosomes that I like. Picture a set of encyclopedias, and you may not be all that familiar with encyclopedias these days with the internet, but I had a set just like this, a set of world books growing up, and you'll notice there's a letter on each. So chromosomes are kind of like encyclopedias, and they're divided into chapters, and those chapters are like genes, okay, where they pertain to a particular topic. I'll say more about that here in a bit. So for now, a set of chromosomes is like a set of encyclopedias. So in our body cells, we're going to have, think of it, the A and the B chromosome here. We're going to have 2 number 1 chromosomes, 2 number 2s, etc., all the way up to chromosome number 23. So in our body cells, we have 2 of each of those, and there's a fancy word for that called diploid. One thing that might interest you is when we look at our 23rd chromosome, if you are a male, generally speaking, your 23rd chromosomes do not match. So that's kind of the one exception that I'm talking about here. You get a Y chromosome from your father, and you get an X chromosome from your mother, and those 2 do not match. The Y chromosome is very small, not a whole lot of genes on that particular chromosome. Okay. So this is what the chromosomes of a pea plant's somatic cells look like. They've got 7 pairs. And again, a pea plant, just like a human, gets 1 set of chromosomes from mom and 1 set of chromosomes from dad. It's just that there's only 7 of them. And I'm bringing up pea plants because, of course, Mendel famously studied pea plants, and we're going to be looking at some some Punnett squares involving pea plant traits later on. Here's some other organisms you might be interested in. You see dogs have a lot more chromosomes than us. Pea plants only have 14. So there's no exact rhyme or reason here. We're quite different genetically than a pufferfish. We're actually more like dogs, but we have close to the same number of chromosomes of pufferfish. Right, before we move on here, I want to review some of what we talked about with meiosis and fertilization earlier on in the unit. So meiosis is the production of sex cells. So in humans, that is sperm and egg. And remember what we just talked about. In the sperm and the egg, you're going to have just one set of chromosomes, or one set of encyclopedias, if you want to use that analogy. And in the egg, you're also going to have one set. And then during the process of fertilization, those are going to combine and form that first cell that we all begin as, and that is going to have two sets of chromosomes. And then from that point forward, mitosis kicks in, and again, we learned about that earlier in the trimester. And every cell within our body is going to have two sets of chromosomes. Okay? So we're going to focus in on those sex cells for a bit here. Sex cells have only one of each chromosome, as we just discussed. One chromosome means there's also only one of each gene. If you've got just one of the book, then you're only going to have one of each chapter found in that book also. So this explains Mendel's law of segregation, which states that a parent will only pass one of its two alleles for each trait to its offspring. Okay? So to go back to our visual here, this is just one set of encyclopedias. And if we're looking at a particular gene on chromosome number 3 right here, then in a sex cell, you're only going to have one of those genes. And again, here is a visualization for the chromosomes of a pea plant. Notice just one of each, 7 total. So your review problem, you can do this on your own, pause the video, see how well you're understanding this stuff. So describe for me how chromosomes in humans are like a set of encyclopedias. Go ahead and pause. Welcome back. And here is your answer. Chromosomes are like a set of encyclopedias in that they contain information, DNA. So DNA, and I didn't mention this earlier, is like it's like the actual text of the encyclopedia, the words, okay? The information is divided into genes, and genes are like chapters, recall. A chapter in one set might be slightly different than a chapter in another set. These slightly different chapters are called alleles. So we're going to talk more about alleles. That's kind of something new that I didn't emphasize earlier. But when we're looking at those chromosomes in body cells back here, up here, the number 1 chromosome and the B number 1 chromosome might not be exactly like each other. In some ways, they're going to be very similar, and in some ways, they're going to be a little bit different. We're going to get into that here in some more detail now. So talking about genes and alleles. A gene is a section of a DNA that controls a trait by producing a protein. And since chromosomes are made of DNA, a gene is also a section of a chromosome. So this picture down here kind of puts it all into context a little bit. Remember, in our cell, that's where the DNA is found inside of the nucleus. So if we zoom in on a chromosome in the nucleus, you'll see that the chromosome right here is actually made of coiled up DNA. And then if we zoom in on a section of the DNA, that particular section, which controls the production of a protein, is called a gene. So in a way, chromosomes, DNA, and genes, we're talking about the same thing. Just like with a book, if you talk about the book, the chapters, and the words, you're really talking about the same thing. We're just focusing on different levels within the book. So here's that word allele again. An allele is a specific version of a gene. So the exact sequence of a nitrogen base in a gene determines which allele it is. different alleles usually have only slightly different base sequences. So later on, we're going to be looking at what we call the tall allele in pea plants and the short allele in pea plants. And this is not the exact sequence of nitrogen bases, but it could be. So notice there's just a couple of these nitrogen bases that are different. And changing a few nitrogen bases could be important enough that it's going to make a pea plant short or tall, okay, depending on some other factors that we're going to talk about here. So sometimes just changing one nitrogen base can have a fairly profound effect. So a couple other words we need to know here, genotypes and phenotypes. The pair of alleles for a gene is called the genotype, and we see some examples of them over here. And we use letters to represent the exact identity of those alleles. So here for this flamingo here, we have two of the same alleles, and we know that because they're represented with capital letters. The expression of these alleles is called the phenotype. So, and I'll show you on the next slide some examples of that. So here is our genotypes for pea plants, and over here is the actual expression of the trait. So for plant height, if we have two big T alleles, then the phenotype is going to be tall, which means a plant with these two alleles here is going to be, relatively speaking, tall. Same thing here with this particular genotype. It's going to be tall. The only way for a plant to be short is to have two of these lowercase t alleles. And remember that those are just symbols for a particular sequence of nitrogen bases. And there are some names for these different genotypes. Homozygous dominant is one name, and that's two dominant alleles for a gene. Heterozygous means you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. I'm going to talk about dominant and recessive here in a minute. And then finally, homozygous recessive means you've got two recessive alleles, lowercase. Okay? So here's some examples of genotypes and phenotypes in humans. If you're a Princess Bride fan, you might recognize the six-finger man here. It turns out that is an actual trait in humans, and it's surprisingly to some folks a dominant trait down here, having a sixth digit. So now we're getting into Punnett squares, and these are probability devices that help us to predict the probability of an offspring getting certain traits. So I want to emphasize that these show possible but not actual results, and they can be used to calculate probability. Okay, so something very improbable can happen. This occurs all the time. So we're just talking about probability with Punnett squares. So let's consider a couple scenarios here. We've got a mom plant, and actually with pea plants, the mom and the dad can be found on the same plant, so it's a little bit confusing. But mom is heterozygous here, has two versions of a particular gene, the big T version and the little t version, and dad is also heterozygous and has a big T and a little t version. So when mom and dad produce sex cells through meiosis, we don't know which of those versions they're going to give to their children. It could be either one. It amounts to a coin flip. So if mom gives the big T, we have several possibilities here. Dad could also give the big T, and that is right there, that outcome. Mom could give the little t, and dad could give the big T, and that is that result. Mom could give the little t, and dad could also give the little t, which would give us a homozygous recessive offspring. And then finally, mom could give the big T, and dad could give the little t here. So when we evaluate these results, it turns out that 3 out of the 4 offspring, or 75%, are going to be tall. Only 1 out of 4, or 25%, is going to be short. And that is because in pea plants, the big T is dominant. And the little t is recessive. So in these offspring with both a big T and a little t, that's these two here, the big T is going to completely hide the little t as if it wasn't even there. So having a big T and a little t is the same as having a big T and a big T in terms of the actual trait. So that's the basics of inheritance and how to use Punnett squares to calculate probability. Had to go kind of fast through that, but I encourage you, if you need a little extra help, to again check out my calendar where there's other resources, and reach out if you have any questions. Best of luck to you. Have a fantastic day.